This podcast is a proud member of the Lamb Podcasting Network. Find the network at largeassmovieblogs.com.
Hello and welcome to episode 75 of the 1001 Movies podcast, based on the book 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die. This time I'll be talking about the 1949 Ealing Studios film Kind Hearts and Coronets, directed by Robert Hamer.
I wrote to the Duke, informing him of Mamma's dying wish. His reply was the curtest possible refusal. Standing by Mamma's poor little grave in that hideous suburban cemetery, I made an oath that I would revenge the wrongs her family had done her. It was no more than a piece of youthful bravado, but it was one of those acorns from which great oaks are destined to grow. Even then I went so far as to examine the family tree and prune it to just the living members. But what could I do to hurt them? What could I take from them? Except, perhaps, their lives.
When English-born Robert Hamer was a 19-year-old student, a teacher wrote in his school report, "His apparent cynicism did not mar an attractive and interesting character, whose fault was a too quick temper, and whose merit an ability to recover good humor very quickly." The statement was both a prediction and an epitaph for Hamer's career in film. Like many other directors, he worked his way up from a cutting room assistant to a film editor for the GPO Film Unit, a division of the UK Central Post Office assigned to make documentaries. When his boss, Alberto Cavalcanti, quit the film unit in 1940 to work at Ealing Studios, Hamer went with him. Back in episode 66, I talked a little bit about Ealing and the production of Whiskey Galore, which was released in the same year as Kind Hearts and Coronets. In its beginnings, Ealing Studios made movies that appealed to the working class, making stars out of actors like Gracie Fields and George Formby. But when World War II broke out, they began focusing primarily on making war pictures. At the time, England had yet to really make a mark in international cinema, and studio head Michael Balcon was determined to make exclusively English films about English people. After the war, it became obvious that people didn't want to see more movies anymore, and thus began Ealing's golden age, when it made three popular films that forever put the studio on the map: Passport to Pimlico, Whiskey Galore, and Kind Hearts and Coronets. This is where Robert Hamer comes back into the picture. His early life was nothing but conventional. He was a homosexual, a cynic, and an alcoholic, three things that weren't exactly approved of in 1940s English society. Most likely, at his family's insistence, he married actress Joan Holt, sister of Seth Holt, another Ealing director, and the marriage lasted about 20 years, and although it's unknown if it was a happy marriage, the biggest thing Robert and Joan seemed to have in common was a love of liquor. Hamer's directorial debut was in a segment of 1945's Dead of Night, a portmanteau horror film that was the forebearer for movies like Dr. Terror's House of Horrors and Tales from the Crypt. He followed this with Pink String and Sealing Wax in 1945, and It Always Rains on Sunday in 1947, both of which he co-wrote and directed, and both of which had themes in which traditional English family values were under threat from immoral forces, like the adulterous wife of a tavern owner and an escaped convict. Hamer clearly reveled in snubbing his nose at the high and mighty, no doubt a hangover from his strict upbringing in a well-to-do Welsh family. In 1946, a novel entitled Israel Bank by Roy Horniman was reprinted. Hamer read it and immediately went to Michael Balcon for permission to make a film of it. The novel was about a Jewish man who kills his family members one by one in order to inherit a title. Hamer's subsequent film, Kind Hearts and Coronets, remained mostly faithful to the book, but the protagonist went from being Jewish to Italian. One just couldn't make a comedy about a Jewish serial killer so soon after the war. And they also changed the ending, which I shall not spoil for you. In Horniman's book, it was also implied that the main character is gay, and although I'm sure that Hamer would have reveled in implying this in his film with a little Hitchcockian subtlety, he steered clear of it. Kind Hearts and Coronets is the story of Louis Mazzini, played by Dennis Price, whose mother was cast out of her wealthy and entitled family after she marries an Italian opera singer. As a result, she forfeits the dukedom which her family would have entitled her to. After her death, Mazzini schemes to kill the 8 people standing between himself and the title his mother deserved, which is initially a revenge plot, but soon morphs into simple greed. One by one he kills them, sometimes using various hilarious methods like an arrow to an inflatable balloon or an exploding can of caviar. Exactly how this turns out I will not reveal, but things come to a head when Mazzini finds himself courting the widow of his second victim and a childhood friend. The dark humor of the story is punctuated by the performances of a young Alec Guinness, who plays all 8 of Mazzini's intended victims, including Lady Agatha in drag. The film was an instant success, resulting in 1949 being a very good year for Ealing Studios. It was nominated for a BAFTA for Best British Film, and Alec Guinness, who soon became Ealing's golden boy, was given the award for Best Actor by the American-based National Board of Review. Kind Hearts and Coronets was the pinnacle of Robert Hamer's career, but things began spiraling downwards quickly for him from there. He would make a handful of other films, but hit rock bottom while working on 1960's School for Scoundrels. Hamer allegedly suffered from alcohol withdrawal on the set so badly that he would have hallucinations. He eventually picked the bottle back up, and after showing up drunk for work, was fired on the spot. He would never work again and drank himself to an early death in 1963. Ealing Studios would continue making films until it sold off its studio to the BBC in 1955. Ealing's last film was The Lady Killers, starring Alec Guinness, which is a topic for a future episode. What did I think of Kind Hearts and Coronets? Every once in a while, I'm pleasantly surprised while doing this podcast by a film that just blows me away. This film is one of them. Kind Hearts and Coronets is everything I love in a good comedy. It's dark, it's cynical, it's witty, and it has a few twists and turns that made me laugh out loud. Hamer's habit of turning his nose up at English stoicism is definitely not wasted here. We're treated to classy music over the opening credits, followed by an opening scene in which officials are preparing to execute their next prisoner, our protagonist, Louis Mazzini. When we first see Mazzini, he's sitting upright at his desk in a prison cell, dressed in a smoking jacket, and writing his memoirs with a feathered quill pen. It reminded me of our first sighting of Hannibal Lecter, a proper man in an improper place, who was nevertheless keeping up the appearance of being comfortable and well-mannered. Dennis Price plays the role with just a slight bit of mirth and sarcasm, and you can see Mazzini's transformation from seeking out revenge to seeking out a title. In the film's first act, he spends some time describing, in a monotone voice just barely dripping with sarcasm, how he climbed the ranks from being a department store window dresser to an assistant in ladies' undergarments. A whole 2 pounds a week for a salary. Later, Mazzini's murders go from opening a lock and watching from a distance as his prey drowns to openly bragging to his final victim, who spends his last moments with his foot painfully stuck in a bear trap. All of this with Alec Guinness in the backdrop, playing each of the 8 would-be victims with the straightest of faces. The only one that elicited a smile from me was as Lady Agathor Dascoyne, whose on-screen appearances total probably less than 2 minutes, just long enough to prevent Guinness's performance from turning into a parody. If there is one thing to be critical about the film, is the third and final act seems to drag a little. With Mazzini's quest completed, it seemed that there wasn't much more of a story left to tell, but the love triangle that ensues only seems superfluous at first, and it serves to make for a smashing conclusion, which I dare not reveal to those of you who haven't seen it. I found Hamer's script so appealing, in fact, that I can't help but wonder what he would be writing in 2018, and I really couldn't think of anything that came close to the tone of this film that has been released in the last 30 or so years. While we have no lack of cynical films today, like 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri comes to mind, it seems like laughing about murder or having a murderous protagonist hasn't really been done adequately since 1988's Heathers. This makes Kind Hearts and Coronets both a trailblazer and a rarity nowadays, with so many scriptwriters bending towards political correctness, even the English ones. That's all I have to say about Kind Hearts and Coronets, but tune in next week when I talk about Swing Time, the 1936 musical starring Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers and directed by George Stevens. In the meantime, feel free to email me any comments or questions at 1001moviespodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter at 1001moviespc. Until next time, happy viewing.